Today I'm going to make a newborn onesie bodysuit. It is called the Newborn Snap Tap Tee. You find it on the Wren Sewing and Crafts, the Wren Boutique on Etsy. Okay, the pattern that I created has pictures and directions and very easy to follow. So we have our pattern pieces and we're going to cut those out next. And it's important to make sure that you cut out the notch as well. Since I'm making this bodysuit with long sleeves, I've added a 1/2 inch line here. I'm going to cut this bottom off and then I'm going to lengthen this sleeve, and I'll show you here in just a little bit how I lengthen it. I folded this sheet in half lengthwise, and then I added the top piece right up here on the fold, matching up that line. Measured 6.5 inches down. I folded this piece so that I could get a crease to lay on that line so I could have it straight. And now I'm going to tape this piece down. So now I have my lines drawn to connect the two pieces, and I will cut it out as if it were one pattern piece now. And this will create a long sleeve pattern. You lay your fabric out and you want to make sure that the stretch is going sideways. You lay your pattern pieces out on your fabric. Many times I have actually gone to Goodwill and found t-shirt material. Actually not material, but old t-shirts. I usually buy the extra large t-shirts for like $1.99 off the Goodwill rack and cut them up and use them. Next, you want to cut coordinating banding that's going to go around the neck and the legs. I chose a darker gray, and you want it 1 5/8. So here's 1 and then 5/8, and then you cut it with your rotary blade. The important piece is make sure that you are on the stretch with your length of your band. You want it stretchy. So make sure your fabric is on the stretchiest piece before we cut it. And I just use my rotary cutter to cut my strip. And there's my strip. Get ready to sew this bodysuit together. For those of you who have been wondering, I want to make sure I say this now so I don't forget. This is a Mickey Mouse head, and I understand the, proprietary issues when it comes to making Mickey Mouse stuff. However, I am not using this for resale. This is purely for my own family. This is strictly for demonstration to show you how I do an applique. Next, we want to put the binding onto the front and back pieces. So we match up the edges, and you can pin if you want, but slightly stretch, just a little stretch and pin, stretch and pin, stretch and pin. This will help your binding lay down. I prefer to just take it over to my sewing machine and lay it on the edge and stretch as I sew so the pins don't get in my way. This is what I mean. I just do a slight stretch, not a lot, slight stretch, lay it down on the edge and sew. Slight stretch, not a lot. You've got to be careful not to stretch this piece. See this? I just give it a slight stretch and sew. And to reduce bulk, you take this binding and trim it down, just the binding, trim it down to 1/4 of an inch. You don't want to trim this though, just your binding edge, your seam. Trim that down 1/4 of an inch. Then you fold your binding over about 1/2 inch and pin in place. And your back should look like this. Your pin should be catching the back. Then we will zigzag in place. I set my machine up with a stitch length width of 4 and a length of 2 for a zigzag. And then I stitch almost like stitch in the ditch so that the zigzag goes on each side. It look like this. And here's your front. Okay, with right sides up, you want to take your back piece and match it at the notch and overlap and then pin across here. Do the same thing to the other side. Your pin should look like this. Next, you just want to go right along the edge with the basting stitch just to hold it in place. So right along the edge, maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, because you're going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance so it won't show. Once you baste into place, then it should look like this when you lay it. It looks like a newborn tee should. On the wrong side of the sleeve, roll up a 1/2 inch seam allowance and pin in place. Now your bobbin thread and your top thread should match, so this shouldn't matter. It's real easy if from the wrong side of the material, if you just do a zigzag and follow this line, that way you get a straight stitch on the opposite side when you do your zigzag. Do the same zigzag that you did for the top of your shirt. Your sleeve hem from the front view. And this is the back view. Sleeve pattern piece laying on top of your sleeve. Mark your center with a fabric marker, a disappearing ink fabric marker. But just put it in the seam allowance here, nothing really big so that it will get caught in the seam allowance. Place a straight pin right here where the front and the back pieces crisscross and place it right in the shoulder seam. Do that on each side. With the right side of the sleeve against the right side of the shirt, you match your center notch, your where your center pin was and your center marking, and you pin. Then you come down to this end and you pin. Then you come to this end of your armhole and you pin, and then you ease all of this in, matching that notch. You just have to, you might have to stretch a little, you might have to manipulate a little, but you need to ease this sleeve in. Then we sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you sew your 1/2 inch seam allowance, then you can finish the seam off with a serger if you have one. If not, just trim close to the seam and let it go, because this fabric will not fray. I chose to finish mine off. This is what my finished seam looks like. Here's my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I took my serger. I always keep my tails a little long, and I just serged along the edge. When you turn your shirt right side out, this is what it looks like. Cute little sleeves. Then all we have to do is finish up the bottom. Okay, so now we're going to get ready to put the binding on the bottom. We put the binding on in the same fashion with a few exceptions. We're going to start over here on a seam. Actually, I think it's this seam because of the way the sewing machine goes. So it's this seam. We want to make sure that while we're sewing along here, we're doing a slight stretch. When we get to this pin, you stop and you just sew regular, because if you stretch here, it's gonna concave in. Then when you get up to this pin, you do a slight stretch till you come down to this pin. You don't stretch here, but once you get back up to this pin, then you slightly stretch again until you get to the side seam. Now I'm going to show you how to start the side seam here in a minute. Okay, I started by pinning down the binding right sides together, but I want the binding folded over here, and notice that it is lined up with my seam, so that when we come back around, our fabric's going to overlap over the top and we'll have a closed seam, a perfect closed edge there. So now I'm coming to the end, and this is up on the leg seam, so I do want to stretch near the end. I stretch right over that seam. And then I'm going to cut just a little bit off here because I don't need that big of an overlap. Okay, on the outside curves, I clipped the outside curve. The leg curves, I don't think I have to clip because, see, they'll lay down nicely. Then you want to do the same thing. You want to go in and trim just the gray down about 1/4 of an inch so it's not so bulky. Then we turn over a 1/2 inch just like we did up around the neckline and pin in place. Okay, so when you pin the bottom, the way you know that you've caught the back side is if your pins are catching it when you stitch in the ditch, because your pins should be in the ditch. Okay, now we're going to zigzag just like we did before. So your bottom binding should look like this, and on the inside like that. At the bottom of the binding, I put 2 marks where I want my first set of holes for my cam snaps. Now I'm going to punch a hole in it with the awl, and then I'm going to insert my snaps and use pliers to put them together. So I have the nice looking snap on the back side underneath, and I have the male over top. Now I'm going to use my pliers and squeeze them together. So I just squeeze this together. This is usually a handheld, but I have mine on a block of wood to make it more sturdy. I squeezed it together and it smashed it right in. Now I need to do the other side. For the very bottom layer, I have the nice decorative piece on the outside. And then this female piece goes over top of this. Whoops, can't do it one-handed. But it goes over top. I'll do it when I get off camera. Then I'm going to use the pliers and squeeze it together. And this is what it looks like when all 3 snaps are on. And this is the inspiration for my baby Snap Tap tee. I couldn't find the right color, so I made my own. I hope you enjoyed our sew along.